Give me 1 second to try and restart Zoom. I'm having some issues.
Okay.
Yeah, no problem.
In the meantime, I'll welcome Chris. Hi, Chris. Welcome to our Capstone presentation session. Very nice to see you here.
Okay, you guys can hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I'm probably currently showing up twice. I joined in one web browser and it was showing everybody's screen as just black. There was no picture at all. So I am rejoining in a different browser, and I'm pretty sure that means the other me will disappear momentarily. But
two of you is great.
okay, so let me pull up the presentation. This is the wrong drive. Okay. Sorry, I've never actually shared my screen. Can you guys see anything?
Yep.
Yes.
You can?
Backyard
Okay.
magic.
Okay, cool. Just making sure. Okay. So my project is Backyard Magic, and this it is a short story focused on discovery, and I'll get into what that means exactly in a little bit. But a fun little thing about this title is one of the last things I usually do for projects is title them. So this was the basically a placeholder, but as I used it for getting feedback and for the proposal or whatever, it just kind of stuck around. So now it is the title, and that's okay. My project is, as I said, is a short story. It's about a high schooler, a girl named Erica Powell, who finds a mysterious staff in her backyard. This image on the right is kind of a representation of what that might look like, but it's not an exact description. It doesn't fit the exact description I give in the story. But she finds the staff in her backyard, in the woods behind her house, and decides to explore its origins. So the story covers her finding the artifact, how she investigates its origins, which involves visiting places like a museum and a library to learn about local culture and why this artifact might be there. And then eventually she is able to tell its full story and decide what to do with the artifact after that. So this project came about mostly as a result of my recent transfer into SOIS. I just came in this past fall. I used to be in the School of Interactive Games and Media here at RIT, but I decided that programming was not for me, but I still wanted to do with systems stuff, but more in the context of a library or a museum. So I decided to do a concentration in museum studies and focus on that. And in one class that I took this semester, which is the history of books, our instructor gave us pictures of old books from RIT's archive. Kind of this image here is an example, and we got images of basically the cover, the spine, of various pages within the actual book, and we had to use these pages to investigate the book's origins and kind of discover who wrote it, when it was published, where it was published, and all sorts of other information about that. So solely using the images we gave us, since obviously we can't go into the archive during COVID times. And I thought this sort of discovery and investigation was really interesting, and I really liked kind of the mystery aspect behind it, and learning about the author of the book and what the book was through discovery and not necessarily just through straight up learning as in a classroom setting. And because of this, since I was kind of struggling to pick this project, I didn't really know what to do. The story that I wrote was born. And to go a little more into detail about that, I've always been big into writing. I've been writing since I was probably 10 years old, so about 12 years or so. But I struggle with completing stories, and I'm sure a lot of people who have to write pieces like that will certainly struggle with actually finishing them. I find starting them to be much easier than finishing them. So for this project, I wanted to kind of use it as a chance to kind of make myself finish a story, start and finish a story, to be more specific. I've completed a few in the past, but very little of the stuff I've actually started has been finished, and I wanted to complete one and be able to spend time revising it. And with the story, I wanted to kind of invoke the senses of discovery and wonder that I felt during that class period. So basically, I wanted to write a story that kind of used that same sort of arc of investigation and learning that way with Erica. And in a sense, I think I wanted to use it to kind of justify my program change to myself, since I think that kind of admitting that you're in the wrong place and trying to figure out what to do next is a very hard thing to do. And I wanted to use this story as kind of not necessarily to just mostly to justify it to myself, to kind of show myself that, yeah, I'm where I want to be right now. And with those ideas in mind, I began working on the story. And to talk about it a bit, the first sentence of the story is actually my favorite, which is funny because I just talked about how beginnings are, well, actually, let me go, sorry, let me take a step back. I just talked about how beginnings are easy and endings are hard, but it goes the other way. Beginnings are also really hard in terms of, for me, in terms of actually figuring out where to start. And I wasn't exactly sure where to start with this, so I kind of fiddled with a bunch of different beginnings for a while and kind of settled on this sentence. I had finally come to the conclusion that the ceiling tile above my seat did indeed have 637 dots on it when the bell rang and my train of thought was completely shattered. With that sentence, I kind of wanted to capture a bit of a tonal shift between an attitude towards learning in a classroom setting and learning in a more hands-on setting through something you're interested in. And because I wanted Erica to be less interested in school and more interested in hands-on, and I wanted to establish this character arc from the get-go. So I was trying to think of kind of a clever and creative way to do it, and this is what I came up with. And it ended up being my favorite sentence in the entire story, which is kind of funny because at one point it was the only sentence in the entire story, but it really stuck with me and was kind of the foundation for how I laid out the rest of her arc as the story went on. And so as the story goes on, I don't want to go over the whole thing because it would be kind of a long, kind of way too long, but Erica, as I've said before, she goes to a library and a museum to do research, and she kind of learns about this local culture that the artifact is from, and she learns about the artifact's history, and she eventually decides to return it to the original owner's descendants. And along the way, she kind of learns a lot about kind of investigating into local culture and kind of how she can help people through, you know, working in museums and working on archaeology and anthropology, and how it's and how the idea of discovery can be very helpful for people. And I think by the end, it's clear that the contrast I wanted to build is clear, that she isn't necessarily interested in school learning, but by the end, it's clear that she is incredibly interested in exploring the world via archaeology or anthropology or wherever that may lie. And so the story is currently in the 25 to 30 page range. It's likely going to stay there, but revisions are currently being worked on. I've sent the project to a lot of different people for feedback, and when you have a English major for a mother, there's a lot of feedback that's going to come from there. So that's currently the last set of feedback I'm dealing with. And my intention with this piece was to create an arc that kind of paralleled my own, and as I said, kind of justify in a sense, which I'm not sure is the right word, but kind of prove to myself that I made the right decision in joining SOIS and focusing on museum studies. And I think that this story succeeds in that. And that should be it.
Thanks, Elijah. I'll go first. So did Erica start in, she's a university student, right?
High schooler.
She's a high schooler, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about, probably doesn't come as news, but talking about, being able to start things but not finish things. The Snoopy's "It was a dark and stormy night" immediately comes to mind. I mean, we never go beyond that first sentence. But so anyway, did you learn anything in the process of completing this about completing a piece of work? I mean, why do you think you were able to complete this when you have a history of not being able to complete things?
So I think it's easy to kind of, I'm not going to say it's easy. I think it's much easier to kind of come up with an idea and say, I'm going to write this and this, than it is actually sitting down and doing it. And I think one of the things I wanted to do here was kind of plan it out super carefully and divide it up into chunks, and kind of, honestly, the deadline aspect of the project was pretty crucial for actually getting it done. Because I think if you're just writing a story for yourself, a lot of the time you might think, well, I have all the time in the world to do this, so I don't necessarily need to work on it right now. And in the end, it just kind of gets abandoned. But for this, I had a deadline the end of the semester, and I planned the whole thing out, and I basically divided it up into chunks that would basically work with the time frame. And I think even if I didn't have a hard deadline when I'd be working on personal work, I think giving myself a time frame and a schedule is very important for actually getting something like that done. And I think that's what I would do to complete future work, and that's kind of what I learned mostly.
Yeah, I guess a lot of writers must have felt the same, that if you have a publication deadline, the deadline is a deadline, so you better do it. We had one student who's already given a presentation talked about having a creative project and having a deadline caused them to think in the end, good enough is good enough. Because it's got to be done, right? So
yeah.
Sometimes you can't do it perfectly, you can't do everything that you intended to do, but you did it. I have one question about the sequence here. I think you said that, I'm trying to think back to when we originally, when you and I talked to set this up. The course, the history of the book, you're taking that this semester, or was that last semester?
It's this semester. I actually just had my last class for it yesterday. Okay,
so you had this idea before you knew what was going to happen in the course, the history of the book, right?
So for the majority of it, yes. This is based on an activity that we did in that class in the second class period.
Okay.
So I hadn't taken basically the majority of the class, but I had done a little.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, I really enjoyed that. I can't wait to read the story. A lot of projects that students present on, I just don't know very much about where they're coming from. But the act of creation and particularly writing is something that I'm really fascinated by. So it was very interesting to hear how your project has evolved from an idea. Anyway, a great presentation. Meg, would you like to take a turn in asking questions?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So Elijah, I thought this was really interesting and definitely a process project. I think that the inspiration that you got, and actually the evolution of how you ended up in SOIS, along with or almost parallel to how you came up with this project idea, was really interesting. In fact, when you finished not telling the whole story, I kind of wondered if Erica's story and your story are kind of similar, or maybe hers is your story about what you want to do, and you know, really the anthropology and sociology, perhaps, of working in museums is really the mission that you have. So I'll let you answer that.
So I wrote her story with kind of, it was certainly intended to be a lot of what kind of attracted me to the field. If it's not necessarily exactly what I want to do, because I don't exactly know. I've only been in this program for a year. I don't know exactly what area of focus I want to do yet, but I think I wanted to capture the idea of her kind of discovering the field she wanted to be in the same way that I did. So it's not, while it's not exactly my story, you're certainly right that they're very similar. And it was written to be that way. So a lot of the story does resemble my own, although she's a very different person from me, and I did intentionally do that.
Right. And is she also energized, or I guess, are you energized in the same way with learning by doing?
I think so, although it really depends. I used to be much better at actually sitting there and just, you know, gleaning information directly to your brain or whatever. But I think kind of college, and especially this pandemic, has kind of taught me that you, at least, if nothing else, trying to learn in a setting that really helps you learn, whether that's a classroom or an excavation site, is much more helpful for actually getting it done. So I think I learned better in that sense, but it's not all the time. It's only part of the time.
Right. Well, I really enjoyed that, and my daughter would express solidarity with a mother that's also an English major. So when she sends paper ideas, it's a very similar sentiment. I think Stephen's son probably way back when experienced the same thing. So I really enjoyed it, and I really look forward to reading your story.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm curious because it's funny. I actually also wrote a story for my project. And I'm just curious about your process of coming up with ideas. Did you plan? Because I know the character came to you pretty easily, or it seems like. But did you plan the story out beforehand, or did it sort of come to you as you wrote, or a little bit of both?
So mostly to make sure I actually completed it. Once I had the character in mind, and kind of the event that would spark the whole thing in mind, I wrote out a plot, basically with a whole series of events that I knew I would write at the beginning, because I knew if I didn't, it would not go well, and it would not be completed in the way I wanted it to. So, which I don't know if you did with yours, but I find it much more helpful to have everything written out beforehand, and it certainly helped with this. So while a lot of the original idea just kind of came, you know, from the inspirations I talked about, are just out of nowhere, all the events in the story were generally planned from the get-go. There were a few things that changed as I wrote and realized some things didn't work, but it was planned. Yeah,
especially with the time constraint.
Yeah.
Great question, Ben. I think that really, you know, I guess the different experiences relate to that question. I've been writing something for years now, and I'm at 130,000 words, and I have no idea how it's going to end. So there's. I don't have a publication deadline, so I guess that allows me to be that flexible in a sense. But yeah, that's a great question. Anyway, why don't you? I guess you're up next. So if you're ready, you can tell us about your story.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. My brother actually he also has a presentation right now, so I have to do a quick makeshift, and I'm gonna have to move really quickly. I just gotta this is the classic both going to school at the same time, so I'm gonna have to move here. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah, give me a half a second. I think I can be right here. Okay, yeah, so yeah, yeah. Okay. Oops. All right. Hopefully this works. Okay, I need to share my screen. This guy. Okay. All right, can you guys see things? See everything?
Yep.
All good? Okay. Okay, yeah, so hang on a second, let me just see how much time I have. Okay, yeah, so I have some pretty strong feelings about design. And I think they're strong enough to document. But my thinking is that most sort of design documents and books that I've read can be a little bit dull and lack emotion. So I thought maybe it'd be a good idea if I shared my philosophy on design through a story. And so, yeah, so I decided to write a short story based around my philosophy on design. So yeah, so actually throughout my college career, my thoughts have only really grown stronger. I started researching a lot of art and design. And then that pretty quickly led into a fascination with the inner workings behind those perceptions and human cognition. And that led quickly into human-computer interaction. And sooner or later, I sort of decided to combine technology with design and psychology, and then throw in a little bit more philosophy of mind. So I have a lot of disciplines that SOIS let me put kind of all together to build my interests. And then beyond those things, I also dove into topics of creativity. And I think I picked up a few lessons on design and creating and building technology along the way. So the first thing is that it can be really easy to give in to complexity. In many ways, complexity is seductive. But I think at the end of the day, really great design is not born out of adding an endless list of features or cluttering interfaces with knobs and buttons, but it's really about challenging yourself to simplify a product down to its essence. I read this great book by Ken Siegel called Think Simple. And it was actually one of the most fundamental books for me in helping me understand what it takes to build really great products. And in it, he talks about the epic struggle between complexity and simplicity. And that was one lesson that I stripped right away from it. So remember that, because I think maybe we'll need it later. So another lesson that I learned was to pay attention to the small things, but not necessarily to go over every detail painstakingly, although that's really important, but really to take the time to notice things, maybe throughout your day, or as you kind of observe the world around you. Because I think it's those small things that sort of help you in the end one day. And especially, I think if you're going to focus on building products and designing technology, human experience is at the center of that. So I said I also studied things like philosophy of mind and Edmund Husserl, who is the forefather of phenomenology, which is the philosophy of experience. Has some really great things to say about that. So definitely paying that. But another thing that I learned was if you create for creativity's sake, then you can kind of get lost in the thick of things. So what I learned was, at the end of the day, really great technology is built for humanity. And in some ways, the products that we build have a way of reflecting those who built them, but also have a way of reflecting those who they're built for. And then on top of that, there's all this reflection that someone designing a product has to undergo about one's own self in order to understand that what they're building is really right. And I think that, like I said earlier, a product built anything for other than the reasons of for humanity can really lose its direction. So I figured I have all these interesting ideas about design, but how do I get those ideas across? And I thought, like I said, it'd be really interesting to express those ideas in the form of a story, because I think that narrative and story is an innately human way of sharing ideas. And so I thought maybe I'll write a story that hopefully makes you think a little bit more about design. And it was definitely not easy. And I don't want to go into every little. I don't think I'll have time to show you the whole thing, what I ended up coming up with. But maybe I can share a few things about how I went about this process. And so the first was to really think about characters. I wanted the characters in my story to embody really innately human traits. I wanted them to come alive in a certain way, but I also wanted them to stand for parts of my philosophy. I needed them to, right? So characters in the story would need to embody things like perception, feeling, sight, but also more abstract concepts. Like I mentioned earlier, the epic struggle between simplicity and complexity. And then they would also need to embody things like, what does creative potential mean? And so I'm a really big fan of Inside Out, so I definitely took that as an inspiration in terms of the way that it approaches characters. And then the next thing was setting, because I figured I could use setting to explore things like human perception. And when I place these characters in different parts of this world, I could use setting to explore things like philosophy of mind and interaction, and make everything as if it were a metaphor for my own philosophies on design. In fact, one of the most important elements of my story, the pond, is actually serves as a metaphor for my feelings on design. That really great design is a reflection of those who build it and also those that it's built for. And so, like I said, things were not easy. And I learned a lot, and I figured that if I spent as much time thinking about things as I did writing things, then my ideas would flow a lot better. So I kind of figured out, I learned that, so what I actually ended up doing throughout the pandemic was taking a lot of walks, maybe like other people. And I kind of learned that if I would give myself space and time on those walks to think about all the ideas, my feelings of design, but also let concepts of the story piece together, then things would inevitably flow a lot better. And so I kind of learned that I had to also, in some circumstances, trust the path, because sometimes I would come across sort of happy accidents that would really make interesting moments in the story. And then, when I thought about it retroactively, I'd be able to sort of put those pieces together. Because for me, there was a big interplay between making a story and getting my ideas across, and having the least amount of lag between those two things. So yeah, sometimes I didn't quite know where an idea would go, but I'd know that if I trusted it, in the end, it would fit into my overall plan. And that's why, yeah, I would tend to give myself a lot of space with things. So even if I was worried about an idea not coming to the right place, I would kind of trust it and let it go for a little bit, and then come back and look at it again. Because oftentimes I'd figure out it could be, if I tried to say too many things and preach about my philosophy, then it would come out in a really cluttered and unnatural way. But really, at the end of the day, my goal was to remember, if I could just say one thing and explain what I believe to be the true purpose of technology through the story, if I could get people to think about that, then maybe I've done things right. And I'll leave you with one quote that a character says, and however cryptic it looks, maybe if you read it, you'll understand what they mean by that. Yeah, but thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Meg, you want to go first?
I'll go first.
Hold on, I lost my mouse here.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm just adjusting my view
No
here.
worries.
Okay.
No worries.
So that was really interesting, Ben. I really like actually
Thanks.
the images and the design of your PowerPoint. I'm assuming we'll read the story.
Yeah, I hope so.
Okay. And I guess my
Yeah.
question is, who is the audience for your story? So lots of inspiration on your imagery of things from our collective youth, I would say, everybody here. But it's a topic that has a lot of maturity to it. So I guess I'm wondering who
Yeah.
the audience, and for others that maybe won't have a chance to read the full story, can you give us an idea of the trajectory and maybe
say it again. I lost the last
and
part.
maybe like a synopsis of the story?
Sure. Yeah. So first thing, the audience, I think, so the audience is really anyone who's interested in design. So my goal was sort of to take these, like I said, I had a bunch of ideas about design, but I figured rather than writing a document like you'd find a traditional design guideline on a company's site or something like that, I figured maybe it'd be a little bit, it could be a little bit more interesting if I told it by the means of a story. And so it's not necessarily, I wasn't trying to necessarily preach my philosophy, but get people to think about design maybe in a new way, based off of the ideas, based off of my feelings on design. And so the story itself, I don't want to spoil too much, but it's about a boy whose name is Rawl, and he lives, and he's born next to the main subject of the story, which is this pond. And this pond has these sort of special magical qualities to it that draws people to it. But it also, like, the water helps to heal the sick. And this boy, he's living with his uncle, and his uncle becomes really sick, and he ends up using all the water by giving it to his uncle to help him. And in doing so, he ends up running the pond dry. And so the story is about him trying to figure out how he can fill the pond up again. Yeah.
Interesting.
And it sort of takes him, I think the closest, one of the first inspirations there was like Alice in Wonderland, I'd say, because in him searching for the source of the pond, refilling it, he comes across very strange and interesting ideas and things. And that's sort of the method that I use to explore my own ideas and philosophies that I've picked up and learned and thought about. Yeah.
Great. I look forward.
It's a little strange, but yeah.
Oh, Stephen, I'll pass it over to you.
So, oftentimes we have the three presenters in these sessions, and oftentimes the three presentations are quite different from each other, and they just don't compare and contrast. But in this case, we have both you, Ben, and Elijah both wrote stories. So it's kind of interesting to hear them both in the same time frame, and there are some comparisons you can make. For example, it sounds to me that Elijah had a more concrete notion of how his plot was going to go, as opposed to you. Yeah. It sounded like you pretty much, you started from scratch, essentially, right? I mean, you didn't.
Well, yeah. No, go ahead. Yeah.
No, so it seems to me that you were very brave to take this on, because, unless I'm mistaken, you didn't know how this was going to go, right? You just wanted to write a story about your philosophy of design.
Yeah. So in my case, the concrete for me was the philosophies. It became even more clear to me as I was writing it. But yeah, the concrete was the philosophies. The experimenting was sort of the dive off the deep end for me, was finding a way to make them into a story.
Really?
Some of initially the characters, I had them, or had some of the character beforehand, but yeah, it's that's definitely.
I thoroughly enjoyed your description of process. For example, going for walks, and I want to ask you a little point about that, because same thing. And
it's a great revelation for me.
Maybe it's an age difference, but I take my phone with me, and then when I think of something, I think I got to put that. And if I keep walking, and by the time I get back, it's going to be gone. So I'm making notes.
Yeah. Definitely. Oh, I've run into so many trees and on my walk, just because I'll be like, oh my gosh, I have to get this idea down, but right. I got to keep going because I got to get home by the end of the day. And so I'll be walking and I'll just, and actually, interestingly enough, some of the ideas from the story, or some of the plot points especially, came to me during walks. In fact, the very end of the story came to me earlier on in a walk. And I knew I had to write it down. So yeah.
So has it been a smooth process, or did you get to a point someplace in the semester where you had a block and you just didn't know what was going to happen?
There's definitely been blocks, and points where at first since I had that concrete idea, I was like, okay, if I could say one thing and get that across, what's it going to be? And that sort of is what created the pond metaphor. But there have definitely been points where I've been like, okay, I have these plot points, and now I need to actually, at first, I tried to write it more linearly and start from the beginning and make my way to the end. But I would get stuck, and I'd be like, okay, let me fill in the plot points that I can, or fill in the parts of the story that I can. And so at some point in the semester, probably halfway through, I kind of gave in, and I was like, okay, I'll begin, because I had that little bit for the end. I'll begin writing the end. It's sort of 3 acts. I'll begin writing the end and kind of get out my idea for the end. And so, yeah, it did become a little bit disjointed halfway through, but then I just kind of had to pick up the pieces.
One last point. So it sounds to me like, from the point of view of who an audience might be, I mean, have you shared this with design professors in College of Art and Design?
Not yet, but I'd love to. Yeah.
Okay,
for
I really
second
hope
one.
you do. It sounds like that they would that would be a very interesting audience for you.
Cool.
And-
Yeah, because that is the main audience. I think that, like, if I were to you know, if I would ever, yeah, if I would ever share a design document, it would have to be in the form of a story like this.
Yeah, they may even be. You may even get a request to use it as a, you know, as you know, to give to students as something to react to as part of classwork.
That'd be
Anyway,
great.
anybody else have any questions? No? Okay. Then Ria, are you ready? Thanks, Ben. Great
Thank
presentation.
you. Thank you, guys. Thank you guys so much. Thanks.
Hello, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ray. Can you see that clearly?
Yep.
It's not the like display notes, right?
No, you're all set.
Awesome. All right. So I did not write a book. Not really my thing. But I did an analysis on the current care of our non-binary individuals in healthcare systems. And I did this by doing a literary analysis and then interviewing individuals within that community about their experiences and the things that they actually want to get out of the medical systems. And using the knowledge they gave me, and along with my own experiences as a non-binary person, I tried to create a system that would bridge the communication gap between healthcare providers and their patients. So a thing of keynote is that I actually had to cut my project down twice. I still very much look forward to adding those two things after I graduate. I just don't have enough time prior to my graduating because I wanted to add the perspective of understanding what healthcare providers are trained for, what they go into working knowing based on their experiences and education prior to becoming a doctor. And then I also wanted to see it applied. I wanted to run a small trial using the system to see the immediate impacts and see what worked and what didn't work so that I could have a more rounded out final product. Neither of those were achievable, sadly, but they're definitely something on my to-do list. So I'll start things off with a lovely quote by Ketel Slagstead. A greater awareness of transgender history can help doctors become responsible, empathetic, and reflective when they meet with their transgender and gender nonconforming patients. So the start of my project, I give a very brief, not so brief history for the transgender community. And it does focus predominantly on the American transgender history. There is more history definitely outside of that and outside of like European culture overall, but it was not the predominant focus since I wanted this to be first executed in the US. So we'll start off with the 1850s. This is when we started introducing cross-dressing laws. Although the first one actually came about in the 1600s, there was this prevalent need for them starting in the 1850s. It was theorized by a few that this is because that's when urbanization started occurring and we saw more fluctuation in gender experiences. This is to say that females who could pass as men had more working and traveling opportunities, and males who could pass as women had more experience, more ability to live as a woman in cities rather than rural areas where they grew up. Next, we see the founding and subsequent burning for the Institute for Sexual Science, which was established by Magnus Hirschfeld. It was established in 1919, burned by the Nazi Party in 1933. Two very key affiliates of Hirschfeld was Eugene Stagnac, who is the one who discovered what sex hormones do, which allowed us to utilize them in medical care eventually, and Harry Benjamin, who came over to the US and started to lead the medical community towards trans care here. Then in 1952, we see Christine Jorgensen make international news with a successful genital transformation surgery. That was in Copenhagen, I do believe. And it was during this time that the news didn't know quite what to call Christine. So there was everything from hermaphrodite to transvestite. And this is when Harry Benjamin started pushing for the term transsexual. Then we have two very key riots that had occurred in the US. We have the Comptons Cafeteria riot, which is basically a police officer was trying to physically force a customer out of the area and had coffee thrown in their face as a response, which had a riot ensue. So when this group actually came back the second night and were completely refused service, they rioted a second time. And I thought this was quite funny because they had just replaced the window from the night prior and they broke the same window. So I thought that was funny. And then in 1969, we have Stonewall Riot, which is more well known because it's such a prevalent place that is recognized. So the police came to arrest both workers and patrons of the area, which saw a riot start to occur. And it was really monumental because it had more than 2,000 individuals during the act of the riot. We then have the creation of gender identity disorder, or GID, in the DSM-4. This was actually seen as a really negative thing by a great number of communities because the gay community had just worked so hard to depathologize homosexuality, but now they're pathologizing transgender experiences. So basically they are considered ill. We then see in 1989 a court case called Price Waterhouse versus Hopkins. This was great because it ruled in favor of Hopkins, who was withheld their renewal of their contract for a taxing firm on the basis of being too masculine. This expanded the legality of discriminating based on sex to discriminating based on sex stereotypes, which allowed for more diverse gender representations because you couldn't be discriminated against based on those either. We then see the removal of gender identity disorder right immediately in the DSM-5 in 2013. They did add gender dysphoria, which depathologized the trans identity, but led to other issues, which I'll get into later. We see that Section 1557 went into effect in 2016 of the Affordable Care Act, which specifically protected against the discrimination in healthcare for their transgender patients, which means that if a patient comes out to their doctor as being trans, then they have to be affirmed. They have to be referred in the right pronouns, referred as the right gender, according to federal law. We then see in 2020, the most recent court case that I could find at this time was Bostwick versus Clinton County, which upheld that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 applied to gender identity and sexual orientation. So that's a very brief, very short synopsis of transgender history in the US. With that knowledge, I would like to bring up two very prevalent issues. We have the medical gaze and transmedicalism. The medical gaze is basically when a doctor approaches a patient and judges their body or their experiences with uncontested authority. This leads to a lot of issues where the doctor's own beliefs are being pushed onto their patients. We see this especially in the well-known cases of female sterilization and how those are withheld on the basis of the doctor supposedly knowing what's best for them in the future. And then we also know transmedicalism, which is the belief that being transgender means you have to experience gender dysphoria, as described by the DSM-5, and you have to undergo a very particular medical transformation that isn't actually the case for many people. So what do people actually want? Because obviously they're not getting it. They want language changes, right? They don't want to be referred to as man or woman when being talked to about their health. A lot of the people I talked with understand there's a difference between talking about what biologically is associated to them due to what they were assigned at birth and their experiences and needs for gender. This means removing the man and woman and discussing things in the light of those with penises, those with vaginas, things like that. Make it more scientific rather than social. They also all reported, every single one of them reported that on their health forms, gender and sex are treated like the same thing. Some of them said that they'll say gender and then male and female and that's it. Other of them just ask for sex and they don't ask for gender at all, which is something that they feel is basically pushing their option of gender care away. They also want to be listened to, which you'd think would be pretty self-explanatory. But in the case of non-binary patients, they don't always want to change everything about themselves. Matter of fact, sometimes they don't want to change anything. But there are certain mental health effects that come with that identity. So it's important for them to be able to communicate their identity to their doctor without being pushed towards transitioning. And then, as I discussed earlier, they don't want services being withheld based on their assigned sex at birth. There was a very big difference in how AFAB individuals or assigned female at birth individuals and AMAB or assigned male at birth individuals were treated when they came out. So one was able to receive more readily these gender affirming cares because we seem to put more pressure on keeping the female body. And then the last thing that was really prevalent was this issue of blaming new or recent issues on transition activities. In one such case, someone had been on hormones for a period of 6 years and suddenly were having issues with their blood pressure. And the doctor immediately said, oh, we'll just take you off your hormones because that's obviously the cause of it, instead of actually looking to see if there was a potential cause to it. So they need to stop blaming every new thing on things without looking at what the big picture is. So in an effort not to run over time, we're not going to play the fun game of, can you tell me all the flags? All of them are gender identities. None of them are sexual orientations. None of them are romantic alignments. It's only gender, but it's okay. The big picture of it is that we can't expect doctors to know every term. It's not realistic. They're continuously changing, and how one person defines a gender is completely different from another person. Some people don't consider non-binary as a trans identity. Other people don't consider agender to fall under non-binary, and instead non-binary be not an umbrella term, but its own identity. It just depends on the person, and the language is ever evolving. So to expect that doctors are just always politically on par with gender discussions, it's not realistic. They have a lot of other things they have to learn. So what do they know? What can we build off of that everyone knows? So with discussing with people throughout my entire life, there are 3 things that have remained consistent amongst all populations. We know femininity, we know masculinity, and we know androgyny. Femininity, those attributes, behaviors, and roles generally associated with women and girls. Masculinity, the same thing but associated with men and boys. And then we have androgyny, which is the combination of those characteristics into an ambiguous form. And the only reason why it's a combination of those characteristics rather than a discarding of those characteristics is because we don't actually talk about anything without attributing it to being feminine or masculine. We always discuss it in that dichotomy. So with that being said, androgyny is, yes, the combination of masculine and feminine, but it's also the discarding of those ideas. So how do you represent this in a way that everyone can understand and also use? I present to you the tuning forks. You'll see on the handle end that we have the not symbol. That would be the representation of androgyny or androgynous acts, states, beings. And then on the prong ends, we have femininity and masculinity respectively. I picked this shape because it allows fluidity and movement for identities like gender fluid, right? But you can't just have one, because we understand gender is really a composition of 2 big things: gender identity, or how you identify, and gender expression, how you express your identity within your particular culture. Because what's masculine here is not what's masculine on the other side of the world. So how would we use it? Let's just say that this purple dot is gender identity. This person would identify as gender fluid. They move. but their experience most of the time is within this center point of femininity, masculinity, androgyny, because they experience everything everywhere. So then we go into the next point, which is gender expression. So when they go into their doctor's office, if we include this simple pictograph, they mark down their gender identity and their gender expression. And their gender identity will tell the doctor what they need to know to perform long-term reaffirming treatment for the patient, while gender expression tells them what their immediate needs are. This isn't going to replace the need to like ask for pronouns or ask what their actual gender title is, but it should allow for more comprehensive gender care rather than focusing on this cookie cutter mold for people. And you can do this one of two ways. You can do a single tuning fork with 2 points, or you can just make 2 tuning forks that explicitly state this is for your expression, this is for your identity. So all in all, it wouldn't take up that much more room on, say, an intake form, but it would allow everyone, even the secretaries, to have that little bit of knowledge to not make it feel like the patients coming in are being discarded for their identity or disregarded for their needs. Any questions?
So thank you, Ray. I'm sorry I called you Ria to begin with. I guess I'm not sure that I knew that, but anyway, now I do. So my apologies. Anyway, so this is a really, I don't know whether deep is the right word, but there's a lot here, right? There's a whole lot here. And there's any number of questions that your presentation might elicit. One thing that occurs to me, first off, because it just happened yesterday, is this was a presentation about accessibility for deaf individuals in the healthcare system, actually in the pharmacy. And you know, one of the things that we talked about was the fact that people just want to go about their lives. They don't want to be, you know, oftentimes they will say yes when they don't really understand what's going on. They just say yes because they want to get out of here. And so there's a little bit of that. I think what you're asking for is quite different from most people's experience. So you've got I would think you've got a pretty steep hill to climb in order to get your thinking here out into the general public, so that people respond to it in a positive way, in a comprehending way. So more power to you. I really, you're going to need a lot of good wishes to basically change the world here. I assume that you focused on the medical system, but I imagine that what you're talking about doesn't just apply to the medical system. I mean, maybe it most directly applies to the healthcare system, but it's got to be much more broadly spread out across our whole culture. I happened to listen to an interview about an hour ago on CNN, where there was a Black woman who was, she was up before a zoning board, and this was in North Carolina, in Greensboro, North Carolina, maybe you saw it. And she ostensibly it was to discuss a zoning issue, and the white member of the board kept on referring to her as Ms. whatever her name was, and she said, "No, I'm not Ms. I'm Doctor." She was an associate professor at North Carolina University, and they over and over again she said, "No, I want you to call me Doctor," and he wouldn't. He just refused to. And the point I'm trying to make, that I think maybe relates to what you're talking about, is that she wanted to be the one to decide how people saw her, and this guy was refusing adamantly, despite the fact that she kept on telling him. Well, anyway, the upshot of the story apparently is that he got fired from the zoning board. So I guess that was a good outcome. But anyway, the notion that, I get to decide how I want you to relate to me, right? I mean, so it seems like it's central to what you're talking about. So let me ask you this. So about your project now, you laid out to begin with a timeline. Did you already know that before you went into this project, or is that's something that you've expanded your knowledge on as a result of this project?
My timeline for overall what I wanted to do.
No, the historical.
Oh, the time. No, I did not. I had a bit of knowledge, admittedly, because of Chris here and taking his classes. So it really provided me a little bit of backdrop for the importance of history, but I had to dig a little bit deeper than I would have liked, honestly, to have full understanding of like the past 400 years of transgender history in this country alone.
So that's 400 years, and it's been a pretty slow evolution, right? I mean, it's pretty slow. So
people fear what they don't know.
And you are, however old you are, what have you? Are you optimistic about the trend? Have you seen change? Is it moving in the right direction? What's your perspective on that?
I would say in relation to healthcare, it depends on where in the country you are, sadly. I think overall socially, we have hit stagnation again, which from my understanding of our history happens every 50 or so years as we just hit this weird plateau of growing socially as a community because people fear what they don't know. And there's always this ever prevalent fear of like, I can't be who I was yesterday because now we know X, Y, and Z. And that's never the case. A great thing about intake forms is that you can actually withhold any of that information. You don't have to legally give it to them. So if people look at this on their health form and goes, that's stupid, why would I do that? They don't have to fill it out. But for the people who want that articulated, it's there for them. Services aren't necessarily needed for everyone. So I think for healthcare really to improve as much as I'd like it to, especially with the non-binary community in mind, we need to fix communication about what it is to be trans or non-binary, depending on if you consider them the same or not, because we still are very much pushing this idea of a cookie cutter system.
Which is what society does in order to, even just to operate, right? I mean, there's a lot of reason why that's true, but it can always be better, I guess. So one of the questions we often ask with these presentations is, where do you take this? I mean, this is a project for a course in Rochester, New York, right? I mean, where are you going to try and develop what you're talking about here in a broader environment?
Yes, like I said in the beginning, I did want to get the perspective of healthcare providers. I waited to get IRB approval for that, particularly because I wanted the providers to reflect the experiences of the individuals that I talked to. So if more people talked about general practitioners than they did for their therapists, why would I interview therapists? So I wanted to properly reflect the populations. So my next step would be to take the information I have about what general healthcare providers these individuals talk to me about and reach out to them, find out what they know, what they're supposed to know, and if they go out of their way to learn more. From there, I can either further develop this theory or I can try to put it into play, if you will, in like a small clinic type situation, such as my hometown, which is a very small population that would be much easier to identify as a subject study rather than like New York City or Rochester, because it's such a large population. So it's really still in its developmental phase. And I want to be able to be fair and use the knowledge of the medical professionals as well, because if we're just pushing the agenda of the patients, then we're not bridging the gap of communication. We're forcing the patient's ideas onto the doctors, which will just cause confrontation.
Okay, well, like I said to begin with, this is but a lot of people who are not in see the world from your perspective, it's pretty challenging, I would think. And so I'm more power to you for pursuing something as challenging as I think, for most of society this is. So the tuning fork idea, and looks like it could be a productive way to get conversations going. Anyway, I great job on your presentation and on your project, and I look forward to seeing where you take it next. Meg, do you have any questions?
I do. So Ray, this is such a bold and much needed project, much needed solution. I'm so fascinated with your choice of a tuning fork. And I guess I would just love to hear a little bit more. I think of a tuning fork and I think of tone and pitch, which I think are actually very appropriate here, and resonating. So I guess I'm just really interested in your process in choosing that visual, and were there other images or other objects that you were considering in thinking about identity and expression?
So I came out when I was 15 to my family, and it was in explaining to my brother specifically, honestly, that I was trying really hard to find a comparison for my experiences, because sadly, he was not of a very progressive mindset. It was really upsetting, because at one point he's like, well, if it's so hard, why don't you just be cis? Which is not the conversation you want to have.
No.
But at the time I was taking physics, and I was thinking just like what you said about tone and pitch and resonance, and how it's this ever moving kind of thing. And in particular, we were talking about the direction of sound, and how sound actually doesn't just move forward, it'll move backwards. Even with a tuning fork, though the sound is strongest at the very end of the prongs, you can actually hear the sound on the handle as well. So I wanted that kind of fluidity and movement, and to, rather than put it firmly on the actual bars of the tuning fork, to allow individuals to also put it like between the prongs if they're experiencing the identity of bigender, or if they're just experiencing gender fluidity within those two things. But if they're experiencing gender fluidity with like androgyny and masculinity, they can also put it behind the prongs. So the only other picture, if you will, that I could consider with that would be, I don't know how to describe the shape, that's really sad, an X minus one of its limbs.
Oh, I got it. Yeah.
But people aren't going to have that be as memorable as a tuning fork.
Right.
Because when you say tuning fork, for a majority of the population, they have a picture in their head already. So if you tell them an X with one of their limbs cut off, you could also end up with them thinking like this, rather than three evenly spaced things.
Right.
So that's really where it came from, and why I decided to stick with it.
So interesting. So is there like, is there low-hanging fruit that you can envision for yourself to move this forward? Because I agree, I think we're moving in a better direction, but in this moment in time in particular, I think that there are challenges, but maybe the most opportunity as well. But I mean, would you consider utilizing something like this, like the tuning fork, doing a beta test or something for a group at RIT, or for, I mean, can you think of, as Stephen mentioned, there are lots of ways in which using your imagery would be helpful, not just the medical field, but have you thought of some other places where the entry point might be a little easier?
I honestly haven't, because it was developed with the idea of getting better care based off the experiences I had growing up and being pushed towards transitioning when that's not what I wanted or what I needed. So it was really keenly developed for medicine.
Right.
Could it be used elsewhere? Yes. The question of when it becomes used elsewhere is that there is a different dichotomy, because we have patient-doctor confidentiality. So when you submit that information, there's no risk of being outed, at least not an expected outing. If they out you,
Right.
you're technically
Right.
violating
Of
our
course.
standards of care. So it becomes different if, like, we apply it to the RIT student population, because now, although we'd like to think that all members of our community are really progressive, they are inviting the possibility of violence, which is never an ideal that you want to look at or
Sure.
admit, but it is very real when we put it in situations where it's not private.
Sure. Oh, I'm so interested. I really can't wait to read your papers and learn more about this. And, you know, I hope that at some point in the near future, this is something that we see, something like this that we see implemented. I'm really, really hopeful for that. And I really appreciate the courage it took to do a project like this. Really do. So, and presenting on it. Nice job. And Chris, I did see your hand up.
Sure, thanks. Great job, Ray. And I'm so proud. So two of the things that came to mind for me were the presentations that we do with the University of Rochester medical students every year, and sort of presenting this as part of gender theory and understanding sort of subjugated knowledges, you know, sort of like the experiences from the perspective of trans people, as opposed to the medicalized version of diagnosis, and how we explain gender and gender experience to our pre-meds or our medical students. And we also, I think you've been a part of training our physician assistance program here at RIT. And I think every year when we go in and do that, we bring in people like Ray and people who have had different experiences with providers and talk to them about, when you become a provider, you know, you need to listen to your patient as opposed to assuming you know who they are and what their gender experience is. Just like you take a sexual history, you need to almost take a gender history of understanding where they are and not making assumptions based on visual appearance or sex assignment at birth. And so, you know, Ray, you've been really, really helpful in those presentations to say, look, you know, don't assume I need to transition. Talk to me as though this is an open question versus a closed question. And I think every year when we get the evaluations from those students, they say this is the best presentation of the year. It's our favorite lecture of the whole, you know, so this isn't something that I think is of course it's a hill to climb, to your point, Stephen, but I think there's kind of a pent up demand for more understanding on the part of our medical providers, at least our young ones coming into the field. And so I think I have a lot of hope for material like this, that we can say it in a new way. We can put it out there in a way that's easier to understand and maybe has more connection to what they already know about the world. And to say, oh, you know, I have been assuming everybody who walks into my office what their gender is. I need to stop doing that. And I've been assuming that if somebody says they're trans, that they need hormones, and I need to stop doing that. And so I think this is really, really helpful to kind of add to that canon of, you know, here's a new tool, here's a new model that we can use to explain some of the experiences of some trans people, you know, because we don't have a model that encompasses everything. We never will. So we need these bricks to keep putting into the wall of our understanding. So I just want to thank you for really the time and effort that you put in.
Thanks, Chris. That additional context is really helpful, especially in knowing, Ray, what else you've been doing with some of this work. So this is fantastic. Any other questions from anybody on Ray's project? No? Okay. Any lingering thoughts, Stephen, from you?
Yeah, talking about the hill to climb, you know, we are privileged, if you like, to work in a university, both faculty and students. And the outside world is a very different place. If you step outside the the ivory tower, you start to pay attention, then you realize that things are not quite the same. And so, you know, there's space in the university to make progress on social issues and cultural issues and identity issues and what have you. The issue is when you go outside, how to expand that space outside of the ivory tower. And so I think that's a big part of the Hill. And, you know, I think the way humans behave is we like to think in terms of it's black or it's white. In fact, skin color is a good example of that. You're either one thing or you're the other. And so, you know, I think that's sort of built into the way humans think, whether they're in the university or outside of it. So that's another part, that's a big part of the Hill. Anyway, that's perhaps not very helpful, but I think that's the way it is. Anyway, Ray, thanks a lot for your project and your presentation. And all three of you, I really enjoyed this session. And now all you have to do is well, we're expecting 2 short stories, but also 2 papers in addition. And then you're done with this course, and hopefully you'll go on to even greater strengths beyond the SOIS Capstone course. So once again, thank you very much.
Great job, everybody. Really proud of your efforts. Hang in there. You're so close to finishing, and take care and stay safe.
Bye.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Meg, you want to stay on?
Yep.
Let me get a cookie.
Okay.
After that, I need a cookie.